So today we're talking about, can sin corrupt the mind? So we know St. Thomas Aquinas tells us sin dulls the intellect, means we're not going to think clearly. We know the Baltimore Catechism tells us that God made us to know him and to love him and to be happy with him forever in heaven. But the first part is to know him. If sin's corrupting the mind and my mind's corrupted, that means that I can't think clearly enough to know God. Therefore, I'm not mentally healthy. That's one of the biggest issues that we face in society today. We think that we have mental health because we don't have a clinical depression or a clinical anxiety, or we're not taking medication for our mental health. And so automatically we think, oh, I am mentally healthy. The real question is, can you use your mind and right reason to rationally get closer to God? That's mental health right there, because that's why we were made. We have to get to the bottom line as to why are we here on this planet, not here forever, right? And if we believe that there's a heaven and a hell, and my ultimate end is to get to heaven, and that's where people are healthy, right? That's ultimate health, the soul, mind, body, the whole kit and caboodle. That's where we're totally healthy. Then I got to ask myself, is my mind in a place where it's rationally seeking to unite the mind, the body, and the soul to God? If it's not, I can't say that we're mentally healthy overall from a Catholic perspective. From a worldly perspective, as long as you're getting up, going to work and doing the grind, and you're not complaining or drawing any attention to yourself, and you're finishing your job halfway or whatnot, you're pretty healthy. That's the bottom line. That's the least expectation. From a true Catholic perspective, though, unless you have the right reason to love God with all your body, all your might, all your soul, which is the first commandment Jesus gave us, then you're not mentally healthy at that point. Your conscience hasn't been formed. You can't be mentally healthy. It just doesn't make sense, right? Ultimate mental health is to not want to sin, to not be compatible with sin mentally, to not allow sin because we know it's going to offend God. Again, the intellect, I have to know that it's going to offend God. So I don't want to touch sin. I don't want to be near sin. I don't want to be near the occasion of sin, lest I offend God. And if I find myself in that place, I get myself to confession immediately. That's mental health. That's really what it comes down to, because now I know I'm doing the right things. Intellectually, I'm following the right path, and I'm getting closer to God, which is the ultimate end. God made me to know him, to love him, and to be happy with him in heaven, and to not sin. So before the break, I was talking about a patient of mine who I was treating once. Nice lady, nice person. Life is in shambles, right? She's obviously going through some major anxiety. That was the main thing I was treating for. She wasn't really depressed. She had a sadness about her, but she wasn't depressed. She wasn't. She didn't have psychomotor slowness. She didn't have any thoughts of wanting to end her life. She didn't feel hopeless per se. She just felt really slumped down, really beaten down, and very anxious internally. She didn't know what to do. She knew that she had to do movement in a particular direction, but she didn't know how. She had this internal brewing where daughters aren't getting along with her, and she can't reason as to why. Her boss is just putting her down, can't reason as to why. Her social life is awful, and she's divorced and doesn't have an annulment, and she's going out and dating, but her dating life, her relationship life, the way that she's conducting herself in light of the Catholic faith is not good. It's not healthy. It's sinful. She doesn't see that because the world's going to tell her differently. The world's going to say, you're divorced. You got to get out there. You got to meet people, right? That's our knee-jerk reaction. But the church tells us, no, that's not the way that we're supposed to use our physical intimacy. If at this point you got a divorce, well, you better go see if it's a legitimate divorce in the eyes of the church, which means an annulment. Do you have a case for an annulment? If you don't, you're married to this person still, which means that you can't be dating anybody else to begin with. And definitely you can't be intimate with anyone else unless you're married to them. So technically, even though you're divorced, could you, in the eyes of the law, you're divorced civilly, could you still go back and live with your husband and have intimate relations with this husband? Yeah, actually, yeah. In the eyes of the church, no problem. You got divorced civilly, but you don't have an annulment. You're still married in the eyes of God. You can still live like a married couple, and you might as well go and make it civilly married again, get remarried, judicially, shall we say. But the church says, well, you were never not married, right? That's kind of how it goes. So for her, what did I tell her? Because she's very anxious. As her psychiatrist, I'm going to help treat her anxiety. We can explore medication. We can explore different therapy modalities. We can do different things and say, hey, let's take care of your anxiety. Sure. Why not? That's what we got to do. But the reality is this, she was Catholic. And as we talked about her spiritual life, I said, well, maybe you want to get your spiritual life in order. You're not going to church. You're not praying much. I didn't mention exactly the dating component because it wouldn't have made sense. Now you're thinking, Dr. Sandoval, but we're Catholic. We have to talk about that. We have to talk. As a therapist, you also got to know when is the right time that this person's going to understand and receive the message of Christ. Why don't we start with the baby steps? Why don't we start with the Baltimore Catechism and work our way up to the Catechism of the Catholic Church? And so what I told her was this. I said, if you're getting your spiritual life in order, maybe you want to get back into the church. Maybe you should think about confession if you haven't been in a while. And you can do your own examination of conscience. You know what the church teaches. You got to go through, I'm your psychiatrist. I'm not here to tell you what your sins are. I'm not a priest. I'm not Christ. But we have something called right reason when we start moving towards God, when we want to not sin. Even if we want to not sin, our mind starts to rationalize again. Because now I have to define sin, right? Now I have to ask myself, well, what is sinful or not? If I tell myself I want to get closer to God, by the very nature of that will, and God's going to be tickled pink even with the slightest inclination we do towards him, God's just going to give us so much more. And he's going to say, okay, let's start down this path. But if I say to myself, I want to get closer to God, I have to be real with myself and say, well, what is going to get me closer and what's not? I have to be honest with myself at that point. So I told her, do your own examination of conscience, prepare yourself for a confession, start thinking about receiving the sacraments again. And I told her, but if all that's too heavy for you, I think you just need to go start to pray. Start with just the basic tenet of prayer. Because prayer already is telling me I'm going to start talking to God. I'm going to start getting to know God again. I'm going to have a relationship with God. And guess what? Now my thought process is going to be compatible with God. I'm going to have compatibility in the way I think. The way I think, when I start deciding what sin is or what sin isn't, I'm either going to be compatible with heaven or hell. I'm either going to think like Christ or I'm going to think like the devil. And the question is, which way do I want to start thinking? Which way do I want to guide my mind? Well, so what happened to her? She said, okay, I think I can do that. I think if nothing else, I can just walk into a church. And, she was making some jokes. She said, I hope I don't walk in and I start getting smoke coming out of my ears and eyes. And I hope that, there's not a lightning bolt. And I think sometimes we feel that way, right? Because we feel like God's ready to punish us, or we're going to walk into a church and we're going to burn, or something's going to happen, because we deep down in our hearts, we know that we haven't been compatible with God. So she said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. And maybe I'll just go sit in front of the tabernacle and start praying. Okay, no problem. That's it. Go for it. I think that sounds great. That's a great start. Let's see where God guides you. At this point, I'm not guiding anybody. I can tell you about your anxiety. I can tell you about your depression. I can treat that. I can recommend therapies. I can recommend medication. Spiritual life, I have no say over. In fact, our interior lives, nobody has any say over. This is where our free will comes in. This is where we got to decide what we want to be compatible with. Again, we can try to live very externally holy looking lives, but really what's in our hearts, what's living in our hearts. We decide that. We make that choice. So what happened to this patient? Her life's in shambles. Things aren't looking good. I tell her, maybe you should pray. And of course, here's your prescription for your anxiety. Go ahead and continue to take your medication. Well, I don't see her for a couple of years. Literally 2 years go by. She didn't come back. And I thought, well, maybe she thought my advice was a bunch of hogwash and she decided to go and, do her own thing or find a different psychiatrist. You never know. It's okay. I don't take offense to any of that, because not every psychiatrist or therapist is going to be the right person for you. So I always tell people, you need to go to whoever you feel is going to help you advance in your mental health, who's going to help you advance in your life journey. And that happens. I think that's wonderful when somebody says, I found this other psychiatrist. Great. That's good, because ultimately I just want you to heal wherever you get that from. Well, what happens? 2 years later, all of a sudden I see her as one of the appointments in the clinic. And I say, wow, okay. She's there. Let's see what happened. I don't know. She hasn't been around for 2 years. So I go up and I go to the waiting room and I call her name for her to come back. And she looks amazing. She stands up. Seriously, she stands up and all of a sudden she says, she didn't say anything. She was wearing like a business suit. She looked pressed and clean. Her hair was all made up. She looked like ready to go. She looked like a businesswoman. And I was like, oh, okay. Before she'd come in and she was wearing regular clothes, but nothing that really stood out. This looked like, wow, do you work here? Like, what? You look very professional. Okay. So she comes in, she looks very professional. She looks refreshed. And she sits down and I say, well, hi, how you doing? What's going on? She sits down and she tells me, I said, so is the medication working? Right. That's the first thing I think of. And I'm looking at her chart and I say, oh, you haven't gotten a prescription for it in a while. Do you need a prescription for the medication? Tell me what's going on. And she says, I'm actually not even taking the medication anymore. I'm not feeling anxious at all. I said, wow, what happened? Okay, that's good. That's wonderful. That was the whole goal. And she said, yeah, I'm actually not here for a therapy session or anything. And I said, okay. She said, no, I actually just came back to thank you. And I said, to thank me for, well, what happened? Tell me. She said, after I left our last meeting, I started to think about what you said. And at first she said, I'll be honest with you, I was a little bit angry because you told me that I should go back to pray. And I said, well, I'm your psychiatrist, so I told you to take your medication and whatnot. But from your spiritual life, from that perspective, yeah, I just mentioned prayer, right? And we all think prayer is innocuous, no big deal. And she said, that kind of made me really angry. I said, why did that make you angry? And I thought, well, she's going to be mad at me. What did I do to her? And she said, at first I thought I was angry at you. She said, but I was kind of angry at myself because when you told me I should go back and pray, she said, I always kind of knew all along that I should be doing that, but I've been avoiding it. It's there, but I just don't do it. And it's kind of one of these things like, when people tell you take your vitamins or eat your vegetables and you get mad because, you should, your veggies are there on your plate, but don't want to do it. But you're mad because somebody suggested you to do the right thing that you should do. So I kind of felt that way. She goes, but I decided, you know what? I'm going to start praying. So little by little, she said, I went to the church. I started sitting in front of the tabernacle. I've been praying a little bit more at a time. And guess what? As I sit there in front of the tabernacle, over time, peace came into my house. My kids are listening to me. We're not arguing anymore. I didn't do anything differently. I just walk in the house. It's peaceful. My boss, for whatever reason, laid off of me and didn't bother me anymore. And now I'm dating a guy who's Catholic and wants to bring me back into the Catholic Church. And I'm looking to see if I should get an annulment or not. And she said, and we're actually living a very holy life. And I'm really inspired by that. She said, it all started because I started praying again. I started doing the right things that I should do. And that's what it came down to. And that's what happened, folks. She's not taking medication anymore. She's not anxious, all because she started to pray. Right order comes into our life. When we stop sinning, we start praying, and we turn our mind back to God to reach ultimate mental health and ultimate holy mental compatibility.